especially as those of you who are university students. There are a lot of translations into Georgian that are not very high quality, and we really take a lot of time to make sure that they're both accurately translated and also enjoyable to read and well written in Georgian. The books, we get books that are either about ideas or topics that are not well known in Georgia, that people don't necessarily know very much about, or there's not very much written about in Georgian, or books like Being Wrong that are about a new way of looking at the world that's different than the way people have usually looked at things, that will that can be of use to people in their day-to-day lives in sort of reframing how we look at life or at society or at the world. So we identify the books, then we get the rights, the copyrights to the books, then translate them. The idea is that we translate them one per month. Sometimes we're a little behind schedule due to funding, but so far we've kept fairly strictly to one per month. This is the third book. The first book was about climate change. The second book was called Globalization and Its Discontent by Joseph Stiglitz, that I've actually seen the English edition for sale here before, but now it's in Georgian. He won the Nobel Prize for economics. Being Wrong was the third book. The fourth book that will come out soon is about China, and the fifth book after that will be about. It's difficult to explain what it's about, but it's largely about the social contract and changes in the social contract in the period after the Second World War. It's not a textbook. It's quite a popular book, but quite interesting, and I think will help people look at the financial crisis in America, the Euro crisis, privatization, libertarianism in a new light and in a historical context. Then we distribute the books, focusing the distribution outside of the major cities. Of course, they're available in Tbilisi and in other cities. But our main interest is in trying to make them available to people in smaller towns and villages. I think we've had a sense that there's not that much interesting to read in villages. That that there, for those people in villages that would like to read and would like to be exposed to big important international conversations directly rather than through some other conduit, it's difficult for them to get their hands on these ideas of these books. So we distribute them throughout bookstores and libraries all over the country, and they only cost 2 lari, which is much cheaper than most books, as you well know. So we'd encourage you to give them to friends you have. And I think my target in this conversation is particularly those of you who have friends and family outside of Tbilisi. You yourselves, being connected with such a glamorous university as Iliauni, you know quite a bit about what's going on. But for those friends or relatives that you have outside, this would be an opportunity for you. So letting them know about the program, getting them to check with bookstores and libraries to see if it's available, or going and picking up the book and bringing it to them when you have a chance to visit would be of great help, because this project will succeed only if there is demand and knowledge about the project in other, throughout the country. The second part of the project is a little difficult to explain, and I think a lot of people have had difficulty understanding how it works since it's new. It's never been done anywhere else in the world as far as we know. But inside each book, there's a short code, and people can text in their name and village, and we will then, when we get 20 people within a village, or a small area, a collection of villages, we'll introduce them to each other. The idea is that we'll sort of create kind of a book club or a network so that they can discuss the project. And so when we introduce them to each other, we'll actually go physically to the village, and the people can meet each other. Then they will get the right, by being a part of Radarami, to send a text message to our short code, and that text message will go to everybody else in the group. So anyone who's read the book and texts us, then if they want to be, they don't have to be, but assuming they want to be a part of a group within their area, then they're going to be a part of a group. They send a text message naming their village, and that text message will then go automatically to 20 people. They can use that to discuss the book, they can use that to arrange a meeting, they can use that to announce a panashvili, or whatever else they want to use that facility for. But thanks to the sponsorship of Magticom, those text messages are free for anyone using Beeline, GeoCell, or Magticom. So the idea is essentially we kind of pick the books that are most discussed in in international capitals like New York and San Francisco and London and Washington and Berlin. We then translate those into high quality Georgian. We make those available at a reasonable price or in a library to people all over Georgia. Then we introduce people to other readers and other people that are curious about these ideas in their area, and we give them a very cheap way to communicate with each other. Now, part of that is we write all of the authors, at least those that we can find contact information for, and ask them if they would like to come to Georgia. The first author to take us up on the offer was Kathryn Schulz, which we're very excited about because of the sort of big idea books that we've selected. This is one that I think independently the most people that I know from Europe and America have mentioned in conversation and mentioned the idea about, and she's coming here for free, which is nice because we couldn't really have had the opportunity to pay her. So we'll start out where I will maybe ask her a few questions, just myself, and then relatively shortly, probably in 15 or 20 minutes, we'll throw the questions open to you, and you can ask her questions about the book. Sound good? All right. So, generally in my life, I've tried not to be wrong. And I think that's true for most people. I mean, there's a lot of wrongness avoidance going around. So the idea of embracing being wrong seems a little counterintuitive. I don't want to be accused of being a sort of cultural psychologist, but it seems to me, for the many years that I've lived in Georgia, Georgians are particularly afraid of being wrong and particularly enjoy being right, more than most cultures that I've spent time in. Maybe I'm mistaken, but that's the impression I have. I have not heard very many Georgian people say, "I was wrong, I made a mistake." I'm sure it happens, but I haven't heard it much, especially men, by the way. So how did you arrive at this idea, at this concept?
Well, maybe I'm secretly Georgian because part of how I arrived at this concept is that I too spent a lot of my life trying very hard to be right all the time and really resisting ever saying I was wrong. And I think it's possible that Georgians are particularly good or bad at that, but I kind of think it's a human condition. Most of us love to be right and really hate being wrong, and we try to avoid it, but we also, we aren't always successful in avoiding it. Obviously, we all make mistakes, and part of what's interesting to me is what happens after we make mistakes, and unfortunately, what we don't do is say, whoops, I was wrong. mostly what we do is we deny it, we get defensive about it, we blame the mistake on somebody else, we try to minimize the mistake. Oh, you know, it wasn't that big of a deal, or I would have been right except for X, Y, and Z. And I felt all of those impulses in myself. And once I started noticing them in myself, I got pretty curious about, and one thing I noticed is that they aren't very good for us, those instincts. They're very natural, we all do it. They tend to be quite bad for our relationships. You know, they cause a lot of arguments between people, they cause a lot of unnecessary stress. And once I started noticing that in myself, I got curious about how it works in the larger society. And what I tried to do in the book was to understand, first of all, why we have such negative associations with being wrong, you know, where that idea comes from. Because on the other hand, of course, we have this idea that everybody makes mistakes. This is a very broadly accepted cultural notion. Human beings are fallible. We cannot be perfect. We all understand that, and yet we really hate to be wrong. So I tried to understand the origins of that hatred, why we dislike it so much. I try to look at why we make mistakes in the first place, in part because I think we have the idea that we make mistakes because we're stupid. You know, that an error is a sign of idiocy or of some kind of intellectual failing or moral failing. That's not the case at all, and part of why I look closely at why we get things wrong is to help us understand that actually these mistakes are the byproduct of a really brilliant, really excellent system up here. And then I look at how we respond in the face of our mistakes. And finally, as you were suggesting, I try to champion this very different attitude toward error, in which we are much more forgiving, both of our own mistakes and also of the mistakes of other people, and much more able to recognize the way that being wrong, however much we might dislike it in the moment, is really this wonderful engine of creativity. It's what helps us advance through life. It's a very large part of, honestly, of just how we grow up.
One of the things that that I've heard a lot in Georgia, and by the way, we have some seats over here. If anybody has anything sitting on seats, please come in and take a seat. Then, you know, come on in. Living in Georgia, I feel like there is a fear of weakness that people feel that, and I'm not sure why, but feel that saying that they're wrong or that they made a mistake or that they've misunderstood something is a sign of weakness, and that weakness is dangerous, that it can hurt you, that if you expose your weakness, that others will somehow use that against you. You know, if you look at survey data, Georgia is a country, like most post-Soviet countries, very low on social trust. If you ask, for example, Americans or Northern Europeans, can most people be trusted? 70 to 80% of the people will say yes, most people are trustworthy. If you ask Georgians or other people from the area, can most people be trusted? 70 or 80% of the people say no, most people cannot be trusted. And maybe it relates to that, but this idea that if you're weak, you could get hurt, and that, you know, being wrong or admitting that you're wrong could somehow illustrate weakness. I mean, have you come across that in other places or other areas?
Yeah, again, I would say, I mean, I can't, I've been in Georgia for, 48 hours, so I can't speak to, what might be particularly Georgian in these attitudes. What I can say for sure is that that particular idea that admitting a mistake is a sign of weakness is incredibly widespread. Now you see it, you see some domains where that's not the case, and it tends to be professional domains. People like scientists, for instance, tend to have I don't know if any of you are studying any of the sciences, probably someone. Scientists tend to have a very keen appreciation of error and to understand this idea that actually it's totally crucial to a developing intellectual process. But most people in general do think that, or it's not even that they think, they feel that admitting a mistake is somehow a sign of weakness. I think this is exactly backward. I think that in fact, to be able to stand up and say, you know what, I was wrong, is an incredible act of strength. And if you ever have the chance to watch someone do it, which unfortunately is rare, you'll see it takes incredible courage, it takes incredible grace, and it takes a lot of self-confidence, really. I mean, people who are able to admit their mistakes are typically able to do so because they recognize they're still smart, they're still complete human beings, they still, have a right to have opinions in the world. They just got something wrong, which is something we all do as human beings. And if you watch that happen, if you watch someone who's actually able to stand up and admit to an error, it often looks like the exact opposite of weakness. As I said, it looks like tremendous strength. I think what's difficult is that, we do have this set of associations, as I was saying earlier. We think that we make mistakes because we were stupid, right? We think that it was we have a bad memory, or we have bad judgment, or we're just kind of unintelligent, we didn't have the right information. And because we believe that mistakes stem from this kind of deficit or shortcoming, we think that admitting a mistake is a failure. The reality is that's not why we make mistakes for the most part. I mean, yes, of course, there's stupid moments, we all have those. But one of the arguments that I make in the book is that we actually, we have this idea that there's like a good system, a good way to think, and a bad way to think. And if you use the good way to think, you're going to come up with the right outcome. And if you use the bad way to think, take shortcuts, you're sloppy, you don't pay attention, whatever, you're going to come up with a bad outcome, which is a mistake. That's not true at all. I don't know if some of you are studying cognitive science, but what we know about the mind is there's one system. And most of the time, that system produces excellent results and right answers. If we didn't get things right most of the time, we wouldn't be as functional and successful as we are. But some of the time, that exact same system produces mistakes. It's not that something's wrong with you, it's not that you're idiotic, it's that we have an imperfect system. And also the world is very confusing, right? We don't have complete knowledge of the world around us. A lot of information is hidden from us. A lot of the data is there, but it's very hard to know how to read it. And we do our best to interpret it in any given moment. Mostly we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong. It's not because we're stupid. It's just, again, a basic fact of life. It's a basic part of being human. It's one of the limitations of the human mind. And I think once we can appreciate that, and appreciate that the ability to acknowledge those mistakes is what enables us to refine or improve our vision of the world and our understanding of the world, we can get past this idea that making mistakes is some kind of weakness. If you are unable to admit your mistake, that is a weakness, because you're never going to learn from it. You're going to totally miss this opportunity to really gain an insight into the world. That mistake is trying to tell you something. It's saying, you gotta readjust your understanding of the world here. And if you can't acknowledge it, you're going to miss out on that piece of learning. And that, I think, is a kind of weakness. But actually being able to accept your mistakes, I think, is a form of real strength.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the connection between decisiveness or action or executive ability and willingness to admit that you're wrong. I always think of this in terms of students writing papers. You have to write a paper about something, and you have 2 weeks, and you spend 12 days trying to figure out whether or not what you want to write about is the right thing to write about, or should you not, or maybe you've got it wrong, maybe you should get more information to see whether or not you've got it wrong. And essentially the decision-making process takes up all of the time, so that you don't have any time to actually execute. You can see that politically as well. I mean, Georgia has experience with leaders that are really pretty good at executing and doing things, but do not necessarily entertain the possibility that they're executing the wrong things, or that what they're doing could be done better. It also has experience with leadership that tends to be fairly open to a lot of different ideas, has a lot of different concepts, but can't actually implement things as the country degrades. And so, how can you be open to making mistakes, admitting that you're making mistakes, but not have that lead to ineffectiveness?
Sure. So question for you guys. I don't know, how popular is Shakespeare in Georgia? Have you read Hamlet? Yeah? Okay. So I think of this as the Hamlet question. Because Hamlet, of course, you know, the sort of famous interpretation of Hamlet is that he's paralyzed by indecision. He can't figure out what to do, right? And the way we read Hamlet is that he's a weak leader and he's a bad leader because he's so obsessively thinking about, you know, do I kill my stepfather, do I not kill my stepfather, that he just doesn't act, right, until it's too late. And that, I think, is the question you're getting at. So are we in danger of spending so much time wondering whether or not we're wrong that we fail to act when we crucially need to? I think this is a legitimate question and an important one. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Okay. You know, obviously there is a point past which deliberating is a problem and can actually paralyze us in various ways. And obviously there are individual people who really are plagued by doubt and spend probably too much time worrying over the right decision. That said, I think that for the most part, we as a society have the other problem. We're much too quick to reach a judgment. We're much too quick to act on it. In a sense, if you think about it, almost in a deep evolutionary sense, we are pretty much wired to come to fast decisions. We're much more likely to err in the direction of acting too quickly with too little information without considering the possibility that we're wrong than we are to miss out on the chance to act because we're so worried about, you know, are we right or are we wrong? I also would say that in general, I mean, yes, there's situations in life where you have to make a snap decision, right? Your life depends on it. You know, a car is barreling down the highway the wrong direction at you, you have to turn left or right, like you just have to decide. Most of life is not like that. Most of life we do have at least a little time before we make a decision to think about all of the evidence, all the factors, what are the options, what other people think, what can we learn before we make the decision. And in general, I think that the amount of time that we spend to stop for just a moment and think, what if I'm wrong here, is so much less than the amount of time and energy and resources we're going to spend if we make a rash decision, if we make a quick and hasty decision, and then it turns out to be a mistake and we have to undo it afterward.
Yeah, you call that the Hamlet question. It could also be called the Iraq question. You know,
it could be called the Iraq, right. So Hamlet is the version where we're worried, and that's actually a great example. So, you know, with Hamlet, the concern is here's a world leader at the time, right? A world leader who doesn't act because he's paralyzed by indecision. You know, I am a citizen of a country whose not current leader, but most recent president before that, had no problem acting hastily without considering all the evidence, and in fact, in the face of many, many people who were saying, look at the counter evidence, look at the counter evidence, we don't think you're right here. None of this stopped George Bush from invading Iraq. I personally think it was a catastrophic decision. I think it was made very hastily and very unwisely and in the face of quite a lot of evidence. And we've all seen what the price of that was. So it's an excellent instance of the costs of acting without considering the possibility that you could be wrong.
Let's talk about the what happens in university classes and lectures a little bit. What if a university professor were to if you take an average university professor right now and how university professors around the world conduct their lectures, and then you were able to encourage them to internalize the lessons of your book, and they were to change in practice what they did during a class and a lecture and how they conducted their relationship with their students, what would that change be?
It's an interesting question because, so I'm from the United States, obviously, and we do many things very, very badly in the United States, lots of things. One of the things that we actually do quite well is higher education. Our university system, for the most part, is really very good, and in particular what I value and appreciate about it is it's one of the very few places in American life that actually is dedicated in some sense to the ideas I'm trying to push in this book. It is dedicated to curiosity. It's dedicated to intellectual inquiry. So in a way, I would almost say, how can the rest of our country and the rest of the world be more like what happens in a classroom at least a good American university? Because I think, unfortunately, in most classroom settings, certainly in the United States, everything until you get to college, and in a lot of places around the world, we actually aren't trying to get people to think about whether they're right or wrong. We aren't teaching them to think critically about evidence. We aren't teaching them curiosity about the world. We're just basically trying to get them to master a body of facts. Now, it's important to learn information. It's important to have knowledge about the world. But I would argue that the much more important thing to do is to nurture this spirit of curiosity. And I don't think you can be a genuinely curious person unless you are prepared to be wrong. I mean, curiosity is essentially the state that you have when you are ignorant and you know you're ignorant, right? There's things that you don't know about the world and you don't understand, and you're really curious to try to understand them better. And one of the things I think about a lot is that we often we place a very high value on knowledge, and as I said, knowledge is important. I personally place a very high value on ignorance, and I guess that would be my answer to your question. I think if I could see university professors doing one thing differently, I wish they spent more time getting comfortable with not knowing, right? And with getting their students to be comfortable with not knowing, because the reality is, you know, the world is a huge, complicated, challenging place. There's a ton of information out there. Most of it is, as I said, hidden from us. We all live in a particular point in space, and we live in a particular point in time. And both of those things mean that most of what happens in history and in life we can't see. You know, right now in this room we have no idea what's happening, you know, 3 blocks down, let alone what's happening in Moscow or New York or San Francisco, and how people are thinking and what they're thinking that might be different from how we think. We have no idea what people are going to know about the world 100 years from now that we don't understand at all. And we don't know even that much about what people thought 100 years ago. And so I think that operating from a place of real respect for the limits of our knowledge, paradoxically, I think is the best way to learn. It's the best way to improve your understanding of the world. I mean, the idea of knowing something is really kind of toxic to learning. It's almost the opposite of learning. Whereas the idea of not knowing is what pushes you forward and encourages you to learn more. And so I guess what I try to foster in people is comfort with doubt, really. I mean, this book, you know, I talk about these kinds of questions and issues in terms of being right or being wrong, but you could just as easily talk about the exact same issues in terms of being certain or being uncertain. I tend to think that certainty is pretty dangerous. I think it's very easy for certainty to lead to zealotry, to lead to extremism, and certainly to be certain is to be sort of done learning. Once you're certain about something, there's no more information you need. Whereas if you're comfortable with doubt, and comfortable with uncertainty, and comfortable with the idea that there's many things you still don't know, paradoxically, that's actually when you're going to learn the most and get the most new knowledge in your life.
Okay. Anybody have any ideas they'd like to discuss? Have you come across any of this in your own lives?
Just a small comment. First of all, you are absolutely right. The knowledge is such a huge thing now, and everything is related to it. Everything is available. So what is the general knowledge that someone, to be knowledgeable and to be right, has to have, right? Because many people, for example my husband, he has his certain interests, and many times things that he knows I really do not know, and vice versa. So who is intellectual and right and who is not? Like, many times one can think that, oh, this person is wrong, like, doesn't have any idea about things that I do know, and it can be opposite. So it is getting more and more difficult to have a certain understanding between people and to more and more complicated. That's the one thing. And the another thing is that the being wrong, it is very much related to how happy you are. It is so much easier to understand that you can be wrong sometimes, and you will feel that you're much more. And I know that many people in Georgia would be much happier if they could admit that sometimes they can be wrong and it is fine. Starting from the politicians and going down to the general society. And the third one, do we have to teach our children that, oh, it's fine to be wrong? Do we have to start from the very, very early childhood that it's okay to make mistakes and you can still be happy with that and you can still be fine with yourself being mistaken sometimes?
These are all terrific questions, and I'm going to take them in the wrong order. I'm going to do 2, 3, 1. So first of all, thank you so much for saying that thing about happiness. The number one most common reaction I've gotten from people who've read my book, I hear from readers a lot. You know, these days anyone can find you on the internet and send you an email or come up to you after a talk. The number one most common reaction I get is, thank you, I feel so liberated. And to me, that made the entire process of writing this book, which was very hard, absolutely worth it. And I think that's exactly right. I think, you know, we don't even realize how much stress we put on ourselves to be right all the time. But so many of us are perfectionists. So many of us have been criticized or punished or shamed for making mistakes in the past, that we hold ourselves to what is actually an impossible standard. It is actually impossible to be perfect. Let me just say that to you guys again. You cannot be perfect. And if you're anything like American college students, it's really bad for you right now. You know, you're surrounded by like other brilliant young people. You look around, you think everybody's more brilliant than I am. They're doing better. I need to take 7 classes and do everything right and, you know, do 6 internships and so on and so forth. It's not actually possible to be perfect. That's not one of your options in life, right? So you're much better off letting yourself be who you actually are. You have a mind. Your mind is amazing. It's individual. It's different from any other mind in this room. And because of that, it is going to reach different conclusions about the world. And in a sense, when you make a mistake, that is your opportunity to say, you know what? That's me. That's my mind. That's what it did. That's great. And accept that part of yourself and love that part of yourself. And I think if you can do that, there is this huge sense of relief and liberation that comes from that. So thank you very much for bringing up happiness. To your last question about whether or not we need to teach children from the earliest ages that it's okay to be wrong, I'm going to surprise you and say no, actually. We don't need to teach children that, because children already know that. We need to stop teaching them the other thing. Very young children have actually no problem with this. And I mean really young, like infants, toddlers, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. Watch children like this play. They're incredibly engaged in the world around them. They're incredibly driven to explore. And they're exploring because they don't understand the world. There's actually very interesting scientific research on this. Scientists will often say about young children that children are little scientists, right? They operate exactly the way scientists do. They use the entire world as a laboratory, basically. They conduct these experiments. Mostly the experiments go wrong, which is also what happens in science. Scientists love it when experiments go wrong, because they prove that the theory that they had wasn't right, and they show them how it wasn't right, and then they have a chance to build a new theory. That's the scientific method. That's how all of science happens. Little children do exactly that. So the issue isn't that we need to teach children that it's okay to be wrong. They understand that. The issue is we need to stop teaching children that it's bad to make mistakes. And that is what we do. We take these incredibly creative, brave, curious, interested little spirits in the world, and from the time they're very young, we start telling them, no, that's wrong, do it this way, don't do it like that, that's not how it's done in this house, that's not how it's done in this classroom. And by the time they're 6, they've got it. They're like, oh, right, okay, there's a right way, there's a wrong way, we better not do that. That's what we need to change. And the first question was?
Relationships.
Yes, okay.
Be different from each other.
Right. So actually I saw two questions in there as well, and I'll answer both of them. One of them was about what to do about how much knowledge there is in the world right now. And this is a real problem. 500 years ago, if you were literate and you spoke Latin, you could actually kind of read every book that had ever been written, which is amazing when you think about it, right? We definitely cannot read every book that has ever been written. We cannot even read every book that is published today. It's not possible. And not only that, we have these, right? We have these amazing devices that we can put in our laps or in our pockets that connect us to essentially all of the information in the known universe. And also all of the misinformation, all of the bad information in the universe. So you asked an interesting question, which is, given that, what is it actually important for people to know? I think that this access to information that we have now, which is amazing and wonderful and transforming the world, including transforming it politically, as we've all seen recently in the Middle East, it's a wonderful thing, but one thing it teaches us is that actually what we can't really do is expect to succeed in life by mastering a specific body of knowledge. There's too much of it. And that, to my mind, is an argument that what we should be teaching instead is the ability to think intelligently about any information we come across. So what we really need to be teaching is basically critical thinking. We need to be teaching people, how do you evaluate whether information is good or not? How do you decide whether something counts as evidence for a given idea or a given theory? What are the sort of basic logical understandings we need to have to be able to interpret information? Because just mastering knowledge, there's no point. A, there's too much of it. B, you can just look it up. What you really need to do is have the set of tools to help you know what to do when you find that information. You also raised the question about, we all know different things, and it's really easy to kind of get into conflicts with other people over what's important or what isn't. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I think one thing that you and I didn't really discuss is that, our attachment to being right, and our sort of default belief that we just kind of are right about everything, it's very, very bad for our relationships with other people. I mean, if you have siblings, if you have parents, if you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you know this, right? I mean, we spend an incredible amount of time arguing over totally trivial things, right? I once had a guy tell me about an argument that he'd gotten into, like a real fight that he'd gotten into, that was, the subject of this fight was the number of carbohydrates in a jar of pickles. Okay, this is the least important thing in the entire universe, and yet we fight about it because we really want to be right. We don't care about the actual issue that's at stake. We care about the feeling of being right. And I think the important thing is to start noticing that in yourself. To start noticing, what am I doing right now? Am I talking about something substantive? Am I talking about the important issue at stake here? Or am I just interested in being right? Because just being interested in being right, again, it basically tends to create power struggles. This is I step forward, I insist that I'm right, you step towards me, you insist that you're right, and the next thing you know, you and I are arguing about who's right, and we aren't actually talking about the interesting thing at all. We aren't really talking about the issue, and certainly what we aren't doing is listening to each other. And I can't say this enough, I think the capacity to listen to one another is really probably one of the most intellectually and frankly one of the most ethically important things that we can learn to do.
Yeah, I certainly found that with this book that it talks about a social problem, but it really speaks directly to each of us individually. And I thought of that in terms of, I have an 11-year-old son who's quite stubborn, quite attached to being right, and as I thought about the ideas in this book, I was thinking, how can I get him to, relax that idea a little bit? And the more I interacted with him, I realized really all he was doing was just acting the way I'm acting, and that what I need to do is I need to lose my attachment to being so excited about being right all the time, and he would follow that lead. And so it's rather than thinking about teaching, what we need to do is think about how we respond to things.
Absolutely, and good for you for realizing that was what was going on, because one thing I would say is that human beings are incredible and automatic imitators. So if you're doing something, I'm going to start doing what you're doing. In fact, I'm probably going to sit like this. And I'm not even going to know that I'm doing it, right? We automatically reflect what's happening around us. And one way you see that is that if we're having a conversation and a little tiny conflict comes up about, a fact, a piece of information, pickles, right? And you decide you're right, and you step forward and start defending that, I'm going to step forward too. And very quickly, you and I are escalating to the point that we really are in the middle of like a large conflict over a small thing. What's good about this is exactly what you found, which is that the imitation, the instinct to mirror each other happens in all directions. If I step back, you're going to step back too. And that, I think, is a really important thing. And it's why it's so important to learn how to do this really basic thing, which is say, you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. Because you will be amazed if you can do that. I mean, yes, every once in a while, the person you're talking to is going to be obnoxious. They're going to be a jerk about it, and they're going to say, I told you were wrong. Most people are going to do exactly what you did. They're going to step back, and they're going to say, I don't know. I mean, you have a point. I could be wrong here, too. And suddenly, you're actually having a conversation instead of an argument.
Other questions or ideas? Yep.
Okay. I have two questions.
Speak as loudly as you can so everybody else can hear you.
On your TED Talk and well, you exemplify this school as an institution with education and this failure test as the example how we label being wrong as a failure and the shameful, things like that. Can you tell which are the other institutions or spheres which also label being wrong as a failure person? And the second question is, as you're a journalist, does criticism have any connection with wrongness? For example, if some politician says that, yes, I was wrong, should we stop criticizing people? Or the connection? Thank you.
Those are both great questions. So to the question of what other institutions, in addition to the schools, tend to teach these set of ideas that being wrong is terrible and shameful and so forth. Unfortunately, the answer is most of them. Most cultural institutions teach that. Now, that's a little bit too strong of a statement because one of the things that's actually very interesting to me about wrongness, and I write about this some in the book, is that as a culture, like in the broadest sense, as sort of human culture, we actually have two totally conflicting ideas about being wrong. One of them is the one you're talking about, which is this idea that it's shameful, it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, it's a sign of being an idiot or of some kind of moral failing. That is definitely the dominant idea in society. We get it through our schools, we get it through our newspapers, we get it through the media, we get it from our families, we get it from our churches and temples, our religious institutions, we get it everywhere. But there's also another idea about wrongness, and it's quieter in the culture. But it also exists, and it's just as old, and you can trace it back thousands of years. And this is the idea that I started off with, which is this notion that human beings are fundamentally fallible. I mean, interestingly, so religion is one of the oldest institutions we have as a culture, right? It predates literacy, it predates science, we've had it forever. And if you look at religious institutions, every major religion in the world says human beings make mistakes. And not only that, but they make so many of them that we need some kind of mechanism for forgiveness, right? This is why the Catholic Church has confession. It's why Judaism has a holiday, Yom Kippur, where everyone atones for their mistakes. So there is a deep understanding in our culture that to make mistakes is human and inevitable and not shameful. It's just a part of life. Even more than that, there's an understanding in our culture that making mistakes really can be a very wonderful thing, that it is not just inevitable, but actually something that, as I said, does really advance human knowledge. If you look at the entire history of science is a history of mistakes. I mean, without exception, the way that we figured out how the world works is we have a theory, the sun revolves around the earth, and eventually we come up with a better theory. We realize that there's problems with that theory. We start seeing counter evidence for it. And lo and behold, we realize we were wrong, and we say, oh no, we got it totally backwards, right? The Earth revolves around the sun. All of science progresses that way. And so if you look in other areas of culture like that, you see this idea that no, actually error is wonderful, it's how we learn. These two ideas are always kind of in tension, in conflict with each other in our culture. And I would say that one of the things that we can do, and that I try to do with this book, is bring this positive idea of error, help it become a little bit stronger than the negative idea of error. Because if you look over history, there's times when the positive idea is stronger. The Enlightenment, right? That was an era when people were actually incredibly accepting of doubt and error. And what happened? We made huge advances as a civilization. Right now I think we're kind of probably at about 50-50 or maybe 40-60, and I would like to see more champions of error. And I do think it is really possible. To the question of criticism and what happens when we criticize people for being wrong. So, yes, absolutely, I think it's a problem. Now, I don't mean that I don't think we should criticize people. Of course we should. One of the jobs of the media is to hold people accountable for their behavior, and especially public figures. If you are a politician, if you're a business leader, you should be scrutinized by the media. And the media should be saying what you're doing is wrong. If you're doing something wrong, the job of a free media is to say, hey, everybody, this guy is doing something wrong. That's hugely important. And I think it's productive. What I think isn't productive is the tendency, in those rare cases when someone does step forward and say, I was wrong, very often the media plays the role of the kid who says, I told you so. And that's a real problem. And this, I think, is true in our individual lives, too. One of the things I encourage everybody to do is to be better about saying, listen, I was wrong. But that's actually only half the battle, right? It is also your responsibility and my responsibility and all of our responsibility to be generous and forgiving and empathetic to other people when they are wrong. Or when we think they're wrong, because they might not be, and certainly when they have the courage to say that they were wrong. It is our job in those moments to not beat them up for admitting their mistakes. And I think that's also true of the media, that there's no excuse when someone comes forward and says I was wrong for not praising that behavior. That is good behavior. When people have the courage and the strength to say, I see the evidence now, I didn't see it before for whatever reasons, and I was wrong about it, that is something we all should be saying, thank you, yes, please do more of that.
So, if you hear yourself saying, all right, then you're doing something wrong.
Right. And to the point of hearing yourself, I think that's really crucial. One of the things I think we can learn to do that make us, frankly, better human beings, like smarter and nicer human beings, is learn to listen to what is happening in your head. I mean, for instance, if you disagree with someone and you hear yourself saying things in your head, you're saying things like, what is this person's problem, right? Why don't they understand me? Why can't they see what I'm seeing? Or like, what an idiot. You need to learn to listen to those voices because they are telling you something really important, right? Which is that you have crossed the line from having convictions and ideas to being stubborn and being certain and not listening. Because I guarantee you that what's happening in that moment is that the person you're talking to is thinking the exact same thing. They're thinking, what is wrong with this person? And why can't this person listen to me? And the fact is they're right. Because you're not listening to them. You're listening to the voice in your head that's saying, you're such an idiot. And so I just want to say this idea of learning to listen. Listen to yourself when you say, I told you so. Listen to yourself when you say, what an idiot. It's a real intellectual advance to be able to do that.
Okay, so when you were writing the book and when you published the book, was your aim, and is it your aim to kind of reshape the already existing institutions? Are you targeting the whole societies and communities? Or do you think it's just individuals who have to change? But don't answer please that the communities consist of individuals. Like, you're targeting specific people because you think that it's our life that is short and that they have to live their lives in a right way, like understanding things in a different way? or you think that these are societies that have changed? You have talked about memories in your book, but collective memory plays a big role, and traditions and everything.
Yeah, it's a great question, and a fundamental question of political science, a fundamental question of philosophy. I mean, this is a very big question, right? To what extent do we function as individuals, and to what extent do we function as members of society? Because all of us, to some extent, are constrained in our behavior by our community. You know, we act in the way that we were raised to act. We think in the way that we were raised to think. To the specific question of who was I writing this book for?
Or now that it is published, like,
right.
You can achieve more, like, you can now targeting groups of people or institutions.
You know,
did you want to?
So, I mean, sure, of course. I mean, to be, like, the really honest answer to your question is I wrote this book for myself. I really did. I never thought for a second about the audience. You know, when you write a book, you have no idea if anyone's going to read it. Most books don't get read. You can't really think about the audience. You have to think about the idea. You have to write about the thing you care about and you love. And then whatever happens, happens. In this case, I was lucky. People read it. But I wasn't thinking about that while I was writing it. Now that the book is out in the world, you know, to be honest, mostly I think about individuals. Partly because reading is an incredibly private thing. In a way, it's very intimate, right? Like, you're reading my book, and essentially, like, you and I are having a conversation, right? Like, that's my mind on the page, that's your mind reading it, and we're having this very long, a very interesting conversation, and it really is a kind of one-on-one exchange. I believe that human beings are amazingly capable of change. You know, we're all resistant to it. It doesn't come easy to any of us, but I've seen over and over again that individual human beings can change. And I believe in that. And in many ways, I wrote the book for individual people who are going to read it and bring it in whatever small way to their own life. And I also think that the gains in your own life are huge. As someone here rightly said, it's about happiness. It's about many other things, but on some basic level, it's about being a little bit happier, a little bit nicer to yourself, a little bit nicer to other people. All of that said, look, obviously, you know, who doesn't want to change the world, right? Every writer, every human being would like to think that they're going to have some impact on the world before they leave it. I don't think, I think this is exactly what you asked me not to say, but the reality is that institutions are made up of individuals. And in particular, I would say there's an individual on the top, or several individuals on the top of that institution. And they have a huge, whatever the institution is, whether it's this university, whether it's an elementary school, whether it's the entire nation of Georgia, whether it's the UN, the United States, there are people on top. And one of the really important things those people on top do is they set a tone for what happens throughout the rest of that institution. One of the things the person on top can do is set a tone that says, if you make a mistake in this organization, you will be punished, you will be shamed, you might be fired. Conversely, of course, one of the things the person on top of an institution can do is say, we all make mistakes. I want to hear about them when they happen, because it's probably a sign that we have something to learn, that we could have a better process in place. It's certainly a sign that we have somehow failed you. We haven't given you the tools to do your job well enough. So it really matters what the individuals on top of organizations are thinking. And to the extent that I would like to see change in cultures, and I would like to help change those cultures, I do mostly do it by targeting individuals, and you can see it happen. I mean, I saw one of the most gratifying things I've seen happen is an entire and very important hospital in the United States say, we have to totally change how we're dealing with error. And there's a case where, you know what, it is an individual. It's the president of a hospital saying, I've seen the light, we're going to do this totally differently. It matters to an entire institution, and more importantly, it matters to every patient and the family of every patient that walks through the door of that place. So yes, I believe institutional change is possible. It's really slow, it's really difficult, and you need the people on top to be behind that change, meaning in charge of that change, leading that change. And for that reason, yeah, ultimately I'm most interested in the conversations I can have one-on-one with people that might change their minds.
All right, I think we got time for one last question, if there is one. Yep.
Okay, you are the big expert, right? Louder. Okay. It's really great that you're doing, and well, you were talking about computers and something like this.
Sorry, about what?
About computers and networks and stuff like this, how we can gain the information. And now then something hit me, and I realized that the social network has made for people a really bad thing, that people write comments and they write their thoughts and they really think that they are right. And nobody argues, and if you argue, you are wrong, and if you don't like, you just don't have to see this, so you can go. And how do you think that, well, I think it's a great disaster. Yes, there is no unlike button.
Yeah.
Yes, so now we become too arrogant, we become too self-satisfied that we are right, and now if we look at other people, they will say that what I'm saying is really right, and you have no right to say something that I'm not right and I'm wrong, like this. It's like small comment for the thing you were saying.
Yeah, you know, I think the issue of kind of the social network effect is a really interesting one. I often get asked about the impact of technology and of these social networks on our relationship to rightness and wrongness. I think it's a little bit mixed, to be honest. On the one hand, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. So, right, there's no unlike button, there's no whoops, changed my mind button. And I wish there were, honestly, because part of what something like a like button encourages us to do is act very quickly, right? It's like it's the fastest thing in the world. You're like, oh, that's cool, and you hit like, and then you're like, oh, actually, that's like a total like fake page that some guy invented, right? And it's too late. You can't really undo it. It certainly doesn't encourage deep, substantive engagement with anything. That's a problem. I also think there's ways that, unfortunately, one of the things that advanced technology and social networking is doing is encouraging us to live in what psychologists and sociologists call homophilic culture, which means we surround ourselves with people who like the same things that we like. That is exactly the Facebook effect, right? So, and what makes it worse is all the stuff you don't see happening. You know you're hitting a like button. You know you're going onto Google and searching something. What you don't know is that Google, which is actually less bad than most of the offenders out there, so I shouldn't use them as an example, but Facebook, all of these things, more and more, they are tracking everything you do on your computer. They're gathering a bunch of data for you, and they are giving you the answers they think you want based on what you've looked at before. This is a massive problem. Basically, our technology is conspiring to hide counter-evidence from us, right? To hide from us everything that runs against what we believe. That is a really good way to start living in a bubble. To have absolutely no idea. You could have the weirdest belief in the entire universe, right? You could believe that Georgia is run by a bunch of 50-foot dinosaurs, okay? And if you believe that belief hard enough and long enough, soon enough, you are only going to see evidence in support of that belief. That is how technology works. That, I think, is a really big problem. It's a technical problem. It's actually a problem we can fix and should fix, and some people are working very hard to fix it. But it's dangerous. That said, on balance, I think the internet and the spread of technology is a good thing, unquestionably a good thing for human knowledge. And again, I would give you the example of the Arab Spring. Not only was the Arab Spring in large part fueled by technologies like Twitter and so forth that enabled people to know in a moment-by-moment way, here's what's going on, here's how you can be a part of it. More important than that, I would say, on some level, the Arab Spring was a consequence of 10 years of internet access in Egypt, in Tunisia. It was the fact that people could suddenly realize, you know what? People in the rest of the world aren't living this way, right? There's freedom out there, there's democracy, there's information. Very slowly we're starting to see this in China. It's why the Chinese government is so unbelievably repressive about the internet. You know what? They're smart. And they realize that it is going to be the undoing of them. They realize that the internet, for all of its flaws, and it has many of them, including the fact that it eats up way too much of our life and we don't spend enough of our time away from our computers. For all that, it is an instrument of democracy. And in that sense, it's an instrument of knowledge. It's an instrument of diversity of beliefs, which as someone who believes in wrongness and dissent and disagreement, I think is hugely important. So on balance, I wouldn't throw it out the window, but we do need to learn how to control it better.
On that note of liking on Facebook, I want to ask you all if you like big ideas and you like the concept of Radharami, find us on the internet, find us on Facebook, like us, send it around to friends, connections, and relatives that you think would be interested, particularly those outside of Tbilisi. It is specifically designed as a way to engage people who are more comfortable reading Georgian or who only speak Georgian in important international conversations without access to the internet, which is the case for about 2/3 of Georgia, and I'm sure many of your relatives. Thank you very much for coming now, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And especially, thank you to Lanik Vingilia, who you're very lucky to have for helping us organize this whole thing.